This is chapter 23, cardiac, and this is part 3. And we're still in decreased pulmonary defects, and the next one is tricuspid atresia, and we have just hit the really bad defects. So tricuspid atresia means there is no tricuspid valve, right? Atresia, the word means it's not there or it's entirely non-functional. So we have no tricuspid valve. So blood returns from the body into that right atria, cannot go down, so it's going to keep that foraminal valley open and go through there to the left side, down to the left side. Some will go up and around the pulmonary or around the aortic arch, and some will cross through a VSD. The only way to even survive in utero, there's got to be a VSD here, and then some blood will cross that VSD and come up and go to the lungs. So that sounds really bad, and it is. So basically this right ventricle doesn't develop because it's not getting used. What goes to the lungs comes from the left ventricle, so we really end up with a single ventricle. This kid's going to need several surgeries, and at the end of it he will not have a normal heart. He will have a single ventricle. They'll use that ventricle to pump to the body, and they'll use one atria to pump to the lungs. So it's really not a great heart even after it's fully repaired. So moving on to mixed defects. So we have transposition of the great vessels or transposition of the great arteries, total anomalous pulmonary venous return, and hypoplastic left heart syndrome. This is just kind of a little study aid. If you noticed, hypoplastic is not a T, but these are both T and they're both really bad. And a tricuspid atresia is a T and really bad. And then a tetralogy, of the T's, it's not that bad, but it can be if that valve is a mess. So if you see a T, it's a bad defect, and hypoplastic as well as a really bad defect. So transposition. This is the aorta and the pulmonary artery are in the wrong place. So blood returns from the body into the right side of the heart, goes up the aorta and out to the body, returns from the body to the right side of the heart, up the aorta and out to the body. And at the same time, blood is coming from the lungs into the left atria, left ventricle, up the pulmonary artery to the lungs, returning from the lungs. So we have two totally separate systems. This kid is only okay as long as the ductus arteriosus stays open. So this is a baby who may have done great in utero, and immediately after birth is going to start looking bad and get worse and worse and worse, and you can put on oxygen, which will do nothing because that oxygen is not getting out to the body. So they will initially go through and make a huge ASD. Instead of just this little foraminal valley, they'll put in that, do a cardiac cath and come in and just kind of pull this open as big as they can, and they'll put them on prostaglandin to keep this open. Prostaglandin is one of the chemicals that are secreted that encourages it to close. So I said that wrong. Prostaglandin keeps it open. Our prostaglandin inhibitors encourage it to close. So they will put them on prostaglandin to try and keep that open as well. But this baby's got to go to surgery within a couple of days of birth. And then they switch the arteries. And as you can imagine, if you cut it off and switch them, that's a really delicate surgery to do that without damaging the coronary arteries, so that we still get, blood flow to the heart muscle itself, and you're going to get scar tissue. So over time, you're going to end up with stenosed areas because scar tissue doesn't grow. So though that can be corrected just with putting in a cardiac catheter and using a balloon to stretch out that ring of scar tissue. But this is a very delicate surgery, and it has to be done very early in life. Total anomalous pulmonary venous return. Total meaning all of them. You have 4 pulmonary veins, right? Pulmonary venous return, and all 4 of them go to the wrong place. Anomalous. They're just wrong. So this, how bad of a defect this is, depends on how bad it is where those veins return. You're supposed to have the 4 coming from the lungs into the left ventricle. Sometimes they'll go like to the abdominal aorta, sometimes they'll go into somewhere else in the aorta. Wherever they go, it's not into the left ventricle, the left atrium. And so we've got to, again, cut things and reattach them where they're supposed to go. So over time, you're always going to have issues with scar tissue needing to be stretched out because scar tissue doesn't grow. You also, and the reason this can be such a bad defect, you may not have a long enough vessel to make it to the left atria. It may, depending on where it went, it may be short. And now they have to start using baffles, artificial pieces put in, which don't grow and are prone to developing clots and things on them. So this is a bad defect. And then hypoplastic heart syndrome. Hypoplastic means it's not there, it didn't develop. So this is a single ventricle. Hypoplastic left means the left didn't develop. You can have a hypoplastic right as well, but our book we're just going to talk about left. So they have the right ventricle. What they're going to end up doing, this is staged surgeries. There's 3 surgeries. As the child stops growing, then it's time for the next one. The last one, usually they're about 5 to 6 years old when they do it. The first one's a few months. And then the next one's, year to 18 months. But they're going to end up using whatever ventricle they have. And if you only have one ventricle, having a left is better than a right. But in a hypoplastic left heart syndrome, we're going to use that right ventricle to pump to your body. Not really adequate. It's only meant to pump to the lungs. The pressure's not really good enough to pump to the body, but that's the best you've got. And then we're going to use a single atria as the pump to the lungs. Again, not really adequate. So this will never be a normal heart, and I'm making this sound like it's really bad, and these kids do remarkably well. You see them running around and playing and acting like an absolutely normal kid. However, they have no ability to compensate. They get a little fluid overloaded, they have to come into the hospital. They get a little dehydrated, they have to come into the hospital. They overexert a little bit, they end up coming into the hospital. So they do remarkably well, but their ability to handle anything outside of normal just isn't there. But in general, they do surprisingly well. You'll see them running around acting like little kids, but they get tired fast. And when they're tired, they've got to sit down because they don't have the ability to just, breathe harder and keep going like other kids can. Okay, moving on to heart failure. I have an analogy for heart failure. I say that heart failure is like a McDonald's drive-thru. What comes in gets processed and goes out. The same for every car that comes into the drive-thru, one goes out. For every bit of blood that comes into the heart, the same amount goes out. That's what's supposed to happen. In heart failure or at lunchtime, more comes in than can be processed and sent out. So if you think of McDonald's, that line coming in, there's 10 cars coming in for every one that can get through the drive-thru window and out. So we start packing in the cars in that line under pressure. That's what's happening in your heart. Now, half of us kind of say, forget this, I'm not staying in this line. And so we pull out into the parking lot, right? And we go inside. Same thing happens. Because there's so much pressure, some of that what's in your bloodstream pulls out into the parking lot. And I want you to think about where the parking lot is. If it's the right side of the heart, the parking lot is the body. If it's the left side of the heart, the parking lot is the lungs. It's wherever it has just come from, because it can't get into the heart. So what does it look like when it pulls out into the body? Well, edema. In adults, that's dependent edema, usually around their ankles. In kids, it's whatever tissue will stretch the easiest. Their eyes, periorbital edema, happens very early on them. Their fingers and their toes swell much more than their ankles. And on a little boy, the scrotum will swell. That's the parking lot for the right side of the heart. And for the left side, it's the lungs. It's that fluid's going to pull out into the lungs, so you're going to see respiratory symptoms, tachycardia, crackles, respiratory distress. Now, where the analogy is different than real life, it would be as if only the compact cars can pull out. And the compacts in your blood, that's water and electrolytes, tiny little molecules or electrical particles that are so tiny it's easy for them to pull out and park. Proteins, those are SUVs. And blood cells, those are like buses, and there's no way that can pull out and park. So what we see pulling out is just the fluid and the electrolytes. Preload and afterload. Preload is the amount of pressure inside the heart immediately before systole. So the amount of pressure right before it gets sent through. Afterload is the amount of pressure after your contraction. And if you think of that McDonald's drive-thru analogy, that little 16-year-old girl has just sent a car through, and she should have a moment to put her elbows on the window and kind of relax. In afterload, there is no moment of relaxing. Everything stays tense because the heart does not get that moment to relax. And then in preload, it's hard to get the blood going through and out. It's there's so much pressure in there right before it leaves. Preload and afterload. So, heart failure. We're going to see this happen if the myocardium doesn't work correctly. And you're going to get tachycardia, fatigue, weakness, pulmonary congestion. Again, this is that left-sided failure, and the parking lot where it's was coming from, where it can pull out, is into the lungs. So you're going to get tachycardia, tachypnea, dyspnea, respiratory distress. If you have right-sided heart failure, you're going to see the systemic issues, that edema, periorbital edema, weight gain because you're moving water and electrolytes out into the tissue. Kids will also get an enlarged liver. The liver is a parking lot that lets everything sit in there. It's not just for the compacts, but it can hold a lot of blood. So on these kids, they'll feel for a distended liver. Your liver should be up underneath your rib cage. You should not be able to palpate it. When it gets enlarged, it drops down below the rib cage, and now you can feel this firm organ below the rib cage, and that's how we label it, as how many centimeters below the right costal margin it is. Distended neck veins, that's hard to see in a baby because they don't really have necks, but that is something else you'd be looking for.